different Chicago Housing Authority sites where we call the projects. So we get Robert Taylor Homes, we get Green, we get all of the kind of sites. And it was an opportunity to visit those sites both in kind of a historical sense, to have a conversation of what, kind of where did this movement come from, both in Chicago, what's happened to it since with this kind of quote-unquote plan for transformation. And really what it was more about was providing an opportunity to have these conversations. So having an opportunity to interact with the residents of the housing projects to get their side of the story. The kind of conceit being that very often, more often than not, we have kind of a conceptual framework of thinking about the projects without having any sort of interaction per se, right? That we're kind of formulating these ideas through scholarly text, or more often than not, kind of mass media, right? Kind of on the news, there's a shooting, there's a death, that sort of thing. But what it was an opportunity to tell the stories from a first-hand kind of narrative and get a sort of interaction. So it's not one group speaking for the other, or one group kind of being voiceless. That was kind of the conceit. Beauty herself, consider herself to be, quote-unquote, a writer and a fighter. She was a journalist for the Residence Times, and she was trying to be active in this way. I'm kind of interested in then what is the difference between activism and artwork? What kind of do we expect from different things, right? With kind of activism, I think there's kind of an expectation of a longer-term sort of involvement. There's an expectation that there might be some sort of response or some sort of action that comes out of it. We're active for this one cause, and we're hoping to achieve this. Whereas artwork can be much more ambiguous, open-ended, that the conversation itself may be worthwhile in and of itself. Kind of just also, I've seen it kind of take on a couple different sorts of responses from the community at large, most often from the blogosphere, with kind of great anonymous dialogue that we can have now because of the internet. Conservative commentators will oftentimes criticize the project for something along the lines of, are we then glorifying this lifestyle of the projects, and don't you know that there's drugs and violence there, and it's kind of, those people are horrible and they should get a job. Liberal commentators will sometimes critique the project in terms of, aren't you putting these people on spectacle? Is this sort of an Oda Benga sort of thing, where you're there to kind of peep into these lives from the bus with a camera like it's Southside Safari sort of thing. I think a lot of those critiques and comments are from people who are just kind of extrapolating from the title of the project, the Ghetto Bus Tour, and taking issue with that. But I think very much we were interested in kind of appropriating these tropes, right? You can take a bus tour operated by the Chicago Architecture Foundation, you can take a quote-unquote gangster tour, a ghost tour. In LA, you can take these tours to stars' homes. So taking that sort of, appropriating that mode of kind of transporting people around, but then trying to say, can we do something interesting and active with that to try and highlight some of these issues inherent in the Chicago public housing. For example, Carol was one of our people that we would go to very often, and she would talk about kind of contact cards with the police and sort of violence that and sort of repression she experienced from the police, which is a sort of narrative that you don't get in the popular media about public housing, right? You kind of get this idea that we need this sort of police framework there to control people, but then by getting a kind of personal first-hand anecdotal account, maybe it kind of resonates a little bit more. The idea then being that if there was to be an outcome, that people could then, it was maybe some sort of didactic function. You learn, you exchange, and then that sort of exchange then disseminates throughout the community when you have these conversations. So the next time you're at whatever, a dinner party, a scholarly function, and someone's starting to talk about, the projects and da-da-da, you can say, I have a first-hand experience. I have met people. We don't have to talk about them in the abstract and kind of secondhand. I've had this experience and then enlightened. So we saw all sorts of things and tried to just educate and make people aware. As you know now, we're in a kind of situation where a lot of the projects are being torn down, have been torn down, and with the kind of hope that then we would have these sort of mixed income communities being built up that people could go back into. The problem with that is, most of the projects have been torn down without any of these buildings then being built, so where do people go? The second problem with that then is that the kind of numbers that they're basing these on, right? So you say, well, 25,000 people live in Robert Taylor homes. Well, okay, that may be all well and good on paper, but in reality, the number of residents there is actually double or triple that. So then when you're creating housing for 25,000 people at some point in 2020, only a third of people can return. So people are really disseminated all across, not just Chicagoland, mostly in the suburbs, but as far away as Iowa, Indiana, and really communities have been broken apart to create these sort of condos, duplex, and single-family homes where people are kind of smiling and laughing and everything's all well and good. So I think a lot of kind of politically and as far as the media is concerned, a lot of these things get glossed over, so it's just an attempt to kind of get in there, get the hands dirty, and get people involved one-on-one with talking through these issues as opposed to kind of having it be so abstract. And I'm sorry to kind of go through this so quickly, but I know there's a time limit. The other project I wanted to talk about is one I conducted at Elsewhere Collaborative Museum, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina. And if you want to know more about the program there, actually Stephanie Sherman, the director, will be at the Hand in Glove conference, so you should talk to her about that. What it is that's a kind of collaborative museum. You come to the museum, you work there. I was invited there to be a fellow. But what really interested me about Greensboro is at the time I was going to be there, they had just opened a new $20 million International Civil Rights Center and Museum. So that kind of clicked with my sort of research as a student of civil rights movements. I wanted to be involved. So I was able to set it up in such a way that it could be kind of a co-residency. In doing that, kind of in going through the museum and working with them, I kind of had some problems, some red flags with their version of the kind of civil rights movement. One being that it was this very kind of literal and myopic view of civil rights, in the sense that it would go from there was slavery in the U.S. to there was Martin Luther King to there's Barack Obama. And it was like boom, boom, boom. Everything's good, right? That was problematic. There were some other problems, which I tried to then address with the museum. I was talking to their directors, their curators, their board, and trying to just have a conversation of why is this your view of the movement? Why are you electing to kind of glide over some other things? For example, all of these people here on the posters and the project that I'll tell you about in a second are not included in the museum. Most notably people like Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Angela Davis, right? People that you would expect kind of just part and parcel to be involved there. The reason the museum's there in Greensboro is that that was the site of the Greensboro Four, having the first kind of lunch counter sit-in at the Woolworths, and the museum's actually at the Woolworths. That kind of sit-in kind of model spread throughout the South and was kind of a catalyst for greater change. So they were doing that, but then other things were not included as well, like the Greensboro Massacre in 1979, which is very much part of the civil rights movement, was not touched upon at all. So as I started talking kind of with the people at Elsewhere and saying, like, I'm having some trouble with this, they started saying, well, we've got troubles with it too, mostly the people in the community. So I started meeting with people in the community of Greensboro who had these sort of problems, but were getting kind of no resonance from the museum themselves, right? It was kind of like they were getting the cold shoulder. So what I decided to do is kind of put out these kind of postings, create a ad campaign, taking on the voice of the museum. So I put it out there in terms of the museum itself was putting out a campaign. Who would you like to see represented in the museum? So you would see across town all these posters, flyers, in the newspapers we took out ads, kind of blasted the blogosphere with who do you want to see? Do you want to see Davy Bates in the museum, And then people, what it was is then there was the information for the director of the museum, Bombadelli. It was his email and his phone number. So you were meant to call and kind of say, hey, yeah, I'd like to vote for, whatever, Harvey Milk to be included in the museum. So he's then inundated with these sort of calls and, just in general, the community starts to talk and it becomes this thing where now it's not seen within the museum as, oh, there's a few lone dissenters that have a problem and squeaky wheels and we could ignore that. But now it's like, oh, the community now is giving us feedback to say, this is something we need to address. So these kind of just shots of the posters. Maybe the negative part from my perspective with the program was then that I was only in town in Greensboro for a month. So this thing kind of took on other people's hands and kind of moved forward. The upshot, though, the nice thing I can be happy to report is there was kind of a community meeting that the museum hosted to bring people in and have a conversation about this. The way they're set up, their exhibition is a permanent exhibition, so it's kind of like nothing's happened yet. but hopefully there are plans to then kind of make it go forward from there. So those are just two projects I wanted to let you all know about, and I think they have something to do with a sense of art and reciprocity.